I make notes myself of things I've read or heard or think of, but mostly I write down what other people say.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, and welcome again to the Chinook Podcast. We are a handful of fellas.
A handful if you got a large hand.
Yeah, actually.
You need like a really large giant
hand. Big hand. Like I'm 215? Yeah.
We are in the Lord's hand.
We are in the Lord's hand, yeah.
He's good with us.
His hands are more than sufficient. So this is Brad Donovan, and we've got Jamie Souls.
Hello.
And Pastor Nathan Zechfeld.
Hey there.
And today we've got another interview episode with a fine a gentleman as you can find in Christendom. But before we get to that, book reviews.
Book reviews.
Can I start?
You can.
Seeing as you referenced Christendom.
I did.
Okay, so I've got a book in my hand here that's entitled The Book That Made Your Worlds, How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization. And this is not written by a Westerner. This is actually written by a guy from India. His name is Vishal Mangalwadi. Mm-hmm. And so I read this book in the midst of COVID, and I just found it an incredibly enlightening book on understanding the foundations of Western civilization. And so he basically covers a whole bunch of things like some of the revolutions that happen, intellectual revolutions, millenniums revolutions. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to find the common thread of how the Bible pervaded the way that Western civilization was built. So anyway, I highly recommend this as a book. I highly recommend Mangalwadi as a high-quality thinker.
Most excellent.
All right. Well, I can tell you what went through my Audible feed most recently that I listened to. I thought to myself, I should just kick back and listen to something here. And so I did. And I listened to a Louis L'Amour book called A Man Called Trent.
Ooh.
Yes. Louis L'Amour. I read a whole lot of his books when I was a teenager. I learned a whole lot about the Old West through his eyes anyways. And it's consistently the nice girl is in trouble. The good guy comes along, beats up on the bad guys, wins the girl.
It's the true story.
It's the true
Kill
story.
Kill the dragon, get the girl.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
That's all good stories.
Repeated 150 times over by Louis L'Amour. So A Man Called Trent.
Yeah, Louis L'Amour understood that when you've got the true story, keep telling it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it worked again and again and again.
Every time, yeah. Oh, man, I love Louis L'Amour. Okay, so for my book recommendation, I've got Made in the Image, Plain Poems by Joffre Swait. I may have reviewed this earlier, but it is no trouble to me to repeat myself. How's that? Yeah,
there you go.
That's not quite a quote of Paul, but very close. Very close. This is a book of poetry, and it's quite entertaining. There's some of them just make me laugh, like this one. It's called Friendly Aphorism. Friends have I by the hundred, friends I fetch by the penny. Friends, where are you, I wondered, for he has none who has many.
That's good.
That's good stuff. It is.
For he has none who has many.
Yes, it's true, and it's well put. Poetry, it's a thing that ought to be cultivated by the Christian man. So, without further ado, today we will be interviewing
Joffre Swait.
Joffre Swait,
Joffre the Giant.
The giant himself.
Yes.
I feel like we've got a couple more minutes to kill before we get him on.
We've got like 1.5.
Okay. 1.5, okay.
1.5 minutes.
Oh, no, more. Oh, yeah, maybe 2.5.
I had a picture taken once standing with Joffre in which I think he was patting me on the head. Mm-hmm. I don't know if maybe he had his arm around my shoulder. Anyways, you could see my face and you could see his chest.
Yeah, I don't know. Is he taller than me?
Yeah, by quite a bit. He's 6'10" or 11, somewhere in there.
And he's as wide as he is tall. Yeah. So when I ran into him, we were down in Moscow for Presbytery a couple years ago, and I got a hold of him. I said, "Hey, I'd like to meet," because I've been following his work for a very long time. And he just finished coaching rugby practice when then I got to come over, spend some time with him, hanging out.
Had a pipe together.
And
And you came and hung out with myself and George Harrell, which is a classic Moscow pastime, is moving from one house to the next.
Yeah, Joffrey and I walked down the street over to George's place to join you and George, which was also fun. So
yeah, that's good. Well, let's try to give him a call.
Let's attempt the phone call.
We might be a bit early here, but that's okay.
We're going to try again. Oh, there it is.
There we go.
Hey, Joffrey.
Hi, guys.
Hey.
How you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. How are you doing? This is Nathan Zeckfeld calling through the Chinook podcast.
Hi, Nathan.
Hey, and I've got Jamie Souls and Brad Donovan here with me.
Hey, Joffrey.
Hi, Jamie. Hi, Brad.
Hey, how's it
Are
going?
we live? You're sounding very formal right now.
We,
Nathan.
we are like live.
Oh yeah, we like
Oh,
the
nice.
shock. We like the shock value of like surprise.
None of us are dead.
You're on the podcast.
I just sound super formal and
Okay,
serious because
cool.
I'm a Dutch Calvinist. So
Oh, yeah. Okay. Right.
So how are you
Well,
doing
pleased
this
to be
day?
on. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming. This is really exciting. So how are you doing today?
I'm well. I'm still caffeinating.
Caffeinating.
It's mid-morning for me. I'm 1 hour earlier than you guys. I'm actually depressing the plunger on the French press right now.
Oh, French
good.
press. That's the way to do it. So I thought what we should do is we should start off by asking you about your life story, where you're from, themes of intellectual and spiritual development, so that our listeners can get a good sense of who you are and what you do, and then we can get into some of your current work.
your poetics and
Yeah.
Yeah,
That'd be great. Okay. Well, I was born in Brazil, and
Brazil.
spent my childhood there. Yeah, so I'm a Brazilian citizen, fluent in Portuguese, but my mom was an American who had been raised in Peru. So there's all sorts of different threads. But yeah, moved back and forth between the States and Brazil for a while. And after, I think it had been like 6 solid years in Brazil. I was 12 years old, and my dad suddenly announced we were moving to Edmonton, Alberta.
Edmonton.
Yeah. So in 7th grade, I still have good memories of going to watch Edmonton Eskimos games and playing hockey with a bunch of Pakistani kids in the back alley, and it was great. It was a good time. Taking summer naps on the banks of the North Saskatchewan.
Ooh.
That was also very cool.
Yeah.
Then continued to move around a lot. I didn't live anywhere for more than 2 years until I was married and an adult. But my dad was not a Christian when I was born. So my mother had just converted. She had started going to. I was born in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, and she had started going to a Bible study hosted by a U.S. Marine who was a guard at the American Embassy, and became a Christian. And so I went to church a bit when I was young. And then my dad became a Christian when I was 8. And, when people ask me for my testimony, I basically give my dad's testimony because I saw the power of that God had to transform immediately. Like, my dad was not a good guy. And then suddenly he was. And, it's not to make anything overly facile or to pretend there wasn't fallout from having a dad who was a bad guy for so long, but he changed instantly.
Wow.
And so it wasn't more than a year later that I walked down the aisle myself, and we were at Pentecostalish Baptist churches, and Baptist enough that my dad actually discouraged me from walking down the aisle, from becoming a Christian. Didn't think I could really understand. And I was 8. And it's a very memorable conversation for me because I knew that a big part of the reason, even at that age, I knew that a big part of the reason I wanted to do that was because of what I had seen happen with him.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot of strong childhood memories, but that's one of them. My dad discouraging me from walking down the aisle. But as he continued to grow, and we continued to move as well.
What did your dad
preaching.
do?
So my dad, my dad does a very niche thing. He got a doctorate in transportation engineering from MIT.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And somehow, go ahead.
Oh, is that the kind of thing that moved you to Edmonton?
No. So he decided, we moved to, my parents never really thought we would leave Brazil. We were actually, they were very disciplined about making sure that we spoke only English in the house, because we had to remember how to speak English. They didn't want us losing it. And, but when we eventually moved to North America, that actually contributed to us. My siblings all forgot their Portuguese, or could understand very little. I'm the oldest, and I was able to hold on to it. I think most of us know Yuri Brito. He moved here when he was 16 with 2 Brazilian parents, and and his Portuguese got pretty rough for a while there. So language can be kind of a weird thing. But anyway, Brazil hit this period of hyperinflation, where you basically prudent fiduciary behavior was to try to get paid early in the day instead of late, because prices would change, and to spend your money as soon as you made it. I think the month we left, inflation was 80% that month.
Oh my!
Yeah.
Oh,
so my dad was, yeah, exactly. But even with all that, like my aunt was visiting from the States, and apparently, like, she had to. It hadn't even occurred to him to leave Brazil until she said, "Hey, maybe you should think about doing something else and then moving elsewhere." So we did. So he got somehow the math that it takes to design subway systems and bus systems is the same math that it takes to do something called choice modeling. So he went to the University of Alberta to get a postdoctorate in marketing, and to do the number crunching that predicts whether a can that is red will sell better than a can that is blue. And somehow that also, you could apply that math to moose migration patterns. I remember he did a project about that.
Okay, you got to get that project into my hands for my next moose hunt.
Okay, right on. Yeah, so all that to say, I kind of still don't know what he does, but I know it's pretty niche and pretty impressive. Yeah, he started preaching when I was a teenager, and so I was introduced to the doctrines of grace through his preaching, that he was just figuring out himself. So we were at an ex-Assemblies of God church, and I remember, I was being confronted with the doctrine of predestination, for example, by my father, but not right next to me up at the pulpit. He's just figuring this stuff out himself, but daring to preach it. And I remember feeling sick to my stomach for weeks over this idea that I would have had, I might have had no agency in my salvation. But we were still very Assemblies of God-y. Then when we moved to Florida, my dad, we sort of, my family sort of started to settle down, but my dad got a professorship at the University of Florida. And my mom told my dad, "Hey, we didn't know anything about Presbyterians, but this stuff you've been preaching about, the PCA, this denomination called the PCA, teaches it." So started going to a PCA church. We're still Baptist. I met my wife at the Baptist Student Union. I became Reformed. Maybe I can throw the first grenade out by saying that I don't think Baptists are actually Reformed, but I became Calvinistic,
right,
and covenantal because of a class at the University of Florida, or at a study center, taught by a Reformed Baptist guy. He went through Calvin's Institutes And so because of this Baptist preacher, I stopped being a Baptist. And
that's ironic.
Yeah. My parents subscribed to Credenda Agenda in the 90s. Yeah. So I ended up going to New St. Andrews for a little while. I did not enjoy the University of Florida. I had gotten married at some point, and so we just moved out to Moscow, Idaho, and I just did a year at MSA, and then went back to Florida, started working at a PCA church. And then, the rest from there is just sort of history, just mostly CREC, several moves, New Mexico, South Carolina, Brazil. And, we kind of supported a church plant in Brazil. And now we're in Moscow, Idaho, and I work as a teacher / literary figure. I'm not sure what I work as. I have various gigs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. Your dad probably looks at you and says, I don't know what he does.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And you're also doing mission work in Brazil, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I have a ministry called Missão Guanabara Mission. And I encourage people to just say MG when the context allows. But it's named after today it's a very famous neighborhood in Rio, but in the 1500s it was jungle, and then for just a brief moment in 1555 it was settled by Huguenots, who were eventually all killed by the Portuguese. But it's named after them. And the first Protestant creed written in Brazil, perhaps actually, the only one that's actually like a creed. And it was written in one night in Latin by three guys who were about to be tried the next day.
Oh, no kidding.
And it's actually really good.
Has that creed been translated into English?
I must have done it at some point, or it's got to be out there in English. If not, I'll make sure that it is.
Yeah.
Because and actually, I'll be speaking at our church's missions conference at the Christchurch. So I'm at Christchurch downtown, but Christchurch in Moscow, Idaho. We're having a missions conference. The focus is Brazil this year, and at the end of March, and I'll be speaking. And I'll be basing a lot of my talk actually on that event.
That's interesting. Yeah. So. That's very interesting. I did not know that there was a creed or a confession coming out of Brazil in that time period.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's
that era when there were starting to be a lot of Huguenots in France and they got scattered. They scattered all over. Like there's a bunch of them moved to Canada. There's a bunch that settled in Nova Scotia and in places like that eventually got uprooted and shipped off to Louisiana, where they became Cajuns.
So the Acadians were Huguenots? I had no idea.
There was a bunch of them that came that when there was some deal made between France and England over one of their wars, and England got control of Nova Scotia and deported a whole bunch of the farmers that were there, Acadian farmers, and they shipped off to New Orleans.
Yeah, a bunch of those.
That was the 7 Years' War.
Yep.
Yeah, I think so.
We Americans call it the French and Indian War. I don't know what you guys call it.
Both terms are used.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, right on.
Because I believe.
Huguenots were all over. Like there were Huguenots in Florida. Yeah. They got killed by the Spanish, of course. Huguenots in Charleston, South Carolina, there's still a Huguenot church there. They were close enough to British influence to be protected. Huguenots tried to settle all over the Caribbean and Central America. Francis Drake and all his raids on the Spanish Main actively collaborated with Huguenot buccaneers / privateers. Because they were overflowing up out of France. France was trying to get rid of them. France wouldn't colonize. I think that's the big reason that Anglo civilization went out in North America.
Right.
The French had been much better about creating alliances, but the whole reason they were better at it is that for them as a trade empire, there were active policies to suppress colonization because they had learned a lesson from the Huguenots. Like, we can't give too much freedom to people because we'll lose control. Which,
right. Yeah,
of course,
these
the
Huguenots,
British eventually did.
If you give them their head, they're going to create a nation here.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And of course, the British eventually, suffered from that with the 13 colonies, but their policy was to give license to create colonies, to create their own. And so I think there were like 3 million English speakers in the 13 colonies when the 7 Years' War kicked off.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no way the French were going to win.
Yeah.
Because, the British had allowed people to, move a little bit outside of their control.
Yep. They decentralized and actually gained more in the end.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And another interesting incident of history is the fact that the British Empire lost America. So you had the 7 Years' War, and then, a couple of decades later, you have the American War of Independence. The British Empire loses America, but the British Empire does not reach its zenith, the peak of its power, until the beginning of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Like Britain,
it's like they started again from scratch.
Yeah.
They had some things going on in, say, like India, but India was still at that time more under the sway of the French. Yeah, it's like Empire 2.0.
Yeah, no, they it's an interesting accident of history.
Right. So these Huguenots scattering from France, some of them wind up in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, Antarctic France is what it's called. You can
Antarctic
actually research
France,
Antarctic France. Yeah.
That's funny.
Huh.
But yeah, it is believed that John Calvin was aware of and approved of the project, like personally.
Okay.
That particular project. But yeah, there were some big Huguenot names because there was a war in France, a civil war,
right,
after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and even before that, like the French structures were full of Huguenots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and so there was a French admiral who actually sponsored this colony, and so some pretty big names involved. But yeah, they went over there, and it's actually a really fascinating story to get into the details of, because there was a man who had persecuted the Huguenots. I'm forgetting his name right now, but he had persecuted the Huguenots, but then converted. But he was only a recent convert. Then he went over, and he ended up taking charge of the colony. There was a whole kerfuffle about the Lord's Supper. Imagine that. And he took control and ended up being the one who, he betrayed them all to the Portuguese. Personally, had some of them imprisoned, and
wow,
it's because he was basically a Judas figure. So he kind of reverted to, whatever his motivation was. I wish I hadn't done this. I wish I hadn't, I had been lying the whole time. Whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the most interesting things from a Brazilian perspective, because one of the things I want to do with my ministry is, because the Huguenots, it's a different civilization than the Lusitanian Brazilian one. But I do want Brazilians to feel like, because they missed out on the Reformation, and we forget how much we got from that, even if we're not really reformed or aware of the Reformation. All the hymns that we sing, all the theological confidence that we have, there's so much we've inherited.
Yeah.
And that's just missing in so much of the Protestant evangelical world, especially because American and Canadian and European evangelicals want to forget that heritage, but it actually leaves a hole when you never ever had it.
Yeah.
So I want Brazilians to feel like it's, this is all part of their history, and that the Dutch colonies, which lasted for several generations in Brazil, are a part of their history as Reformed Christians.
Yeah.
That this Huguenot thing is a part of their history.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting is one of the founding fathers, one of the figures of the Second Republic, especially of Brazil, promoted as think of this guy as a part of the story of Brazil, was a Jesuit priest whose last name was Anchieta. He's famous for a bunch of other things he did later, but he was a young man when this happened with the Huguenots, and a few of the survivors were taken up north in Brazil to be tried. And this young man, Anchieta, personally assisted the executioner in executing these Huguenots, and then went on to become a famous founder of all things Brazilian. So an interesting curse, perhaps.
Huh. That is very interesting.
Yeah. I was delighted to learn when I read a long biography of the father of Canada, Samuel de Champlain, as having been raised a Huguenot, and only converted to Roman Catholicism because you had to if you're going to be a ship's captain for France. But he was very Protestant. And so finding that kind of stuff in your country's roots, that's important.
Yes, I think it is, especially if you're in, because you guys live as English-speaking Canadians in a post-Protestant world. But imagine that you actually were in a Catholic or post-Catholic world. I think it would become even more important to have that feeling.
Yeah, and
that's interesting with Champlain. It's I think we forget how complicated that time was, and we draw all these sharp boundaries that didn't really exist in people's minds. Like Erasmus, in my mind, was a reformer, even though he never left the Roman Church.
Yeah.
Pascal is a Protestant thinker, even though he never left the Roman Church.
Yeah.
Even I'm working on a project translating Don Quixote right now, and I see it as a product of that time. There's a lot of critique of the church, and a lot of people read the ridicule of the church in Quixote as a Voltaire style ridiculing of Christianity and of theology.
But it's not coming from there. It's coming from these Protestants.
Yeah.
Right.
He wasn't. I'm not claiming he was Protestant, but he actually was connected to the city of Seville, which is where the Bible was translated into Spanish, where all the reformers were, who eventually were executed or whatever. But there was, and the Reformation has a lot of Italian roots. We forget that things didn't have to work out the way they did. This is how God wanted it. And it was a lot more complicated, and people had to live lives during that time. Interesting stuff.
It is.
I was going to say, even Spain had a lot of reformational work happening. It just got crushed in Spain.
Yeah.
But it's kind of cool. It's interesting to know little details about that kind of thing, and what a difference the inheritance and the early victories made. The Portuguese Bible used by Protestant evangelicals today, and the Spanish Bible used by Protestant evangelicals today, and really by almost anyone who uses the Bible in both languages, were basically done by one guy.
Really?
Who ended up, because what would happen is they would get help from business people, church leaders, scholars all over Europe. Or in the case of the Portuguese one, all over India. It was mostly Dutch people helping that one. All over the Indies, I should say. So India, Indonesia. But so other people made the actual, so some Swiss businessmen published the first Reformation era Spanish Bible. But it's like one dude with everyone else trying to help make it happen, which is very different from what happened with the King James.
Yes.
And, we have 30 translations in English. There are a half dozen. And there was only one before the 20th century in Portuguese or in Spanish.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So with now I'm not really familiar with Portuguese or Spanish. In English, we've got like Old, Middle, and Modern English. Modern English kind of starting at about Shakespeare and the King James. Does Portuguese and Spanish have something similar operating? So if you've got like this old translation in Portuguese or in Spanish, is it easy to comprehend for a modern Portuguese or Spanish speaker, or is it kind of antique?
It depends on your level of education, but the one word answer is yes. Yes, it is easier.
Okay.
So there's been a lot less change. So I can read. So I'm going to give a date that's pretty early, and I know that it's the fact that I get to mix Spanish with Portuguese and Latin when I do this. But I can read Spanish stuff from the 1100s.
Oh wow!
As kind of Spanish, 1500s Spanish, like with Quixote. I mean, if you just ask some random person from Mexico or Colombia, they'd probably think that, this is, pretty formal, kind of difficult Spanish. They say the same thing about the Bible, even. But not to the degree of Shakespeare to our English or King James to our English. It's way closer.
Yeah, because if I'm going to read 11th century English, like that's even before Chaucer.
Yeah,
It's another language.
It's another language.
Yeah, we're getting into Beowulf territory. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Huh.
Yeah. I mean, Middle English is a huge struggle, and it needs to be highly glossed.
Yes.
And then Old English, forget it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So just a lot less change.
Yeah. With Old English, you're better off being a Dutch speaker. Yeah. So I have a question. I have a question about this Don Quixote work. So I've as soon as you said on Substack that you were translating this thing, my ears perked up because I made an attempt. It was a good faith attempt. One time at Don Quixote, and I didn't get very far. Now, it could have been me being stupid or the translation being bad, but what drew you to Don Quixote? Why did you want to translate this marvelous novel?
So before you start, I've read it and I've highly enjoyed it, but it could probably use better translation. So I'm happy to hear that you're doing that.
I'm really glad you think so. Yeah. The funny thing is, I've never read the whole thing in English.
Right.
So I've read bits of translated stuff, but I've only read it in Spanish. So I feel like I had a certain experience that when I read the translators, I don't think they had that same experience. And of course, anyone who's going to embark on a project like this has an agenda.
Right.
Is it Emily Watson who is that the name of the woman who recently did the Iliad and the Odyssey? And it's very, it's not just feminist. It's weak. It's like weak poetry. But she had her motivations. I have mine, which is to make the book seem a lot more glad and Chestertonian and not Enlightenment lens. I think people view it through the lens of the Enlightenment.
That's interesting.
So they're a lot more cynical about it. It is, of course, a satire, and there's lots of irony and lots of moments of cynicism. But I think that at the end of the day, the novel is an affirmation of true nobility, and it's challenging us to. I mean, there's, I don't see how an entire nation and civilization really could make a character who is just a sarcastic caricature their national hero. But that's what he is for Spain.
Yeah.
He is like, he represents us. He's not a fool. He is admirable in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's crazy, and even though he does a lot of foolish things, that he attacks windmills, and I want to transmit that.
Okay, because that makes good sense to me. I've found whenever I've read up on Spanish things or read stuff by Spaniards, it was like looking into a different world, and it
is a different world. Yeah,
it's like the keen sense of the appreciation of the ridiculous is something that I would.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I think we could go down all sorts of rabbit trails with that. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we do, but it was. You can tell which countries missed out on the Reformation, and when most Protestants say that, they mean economically.
Yes.
I mean, Spain. If they suffered economically from losing out on the Reformation, it was because they drowned themselves in gold.
Yes.
There were like literal deflation, devaluing problems. But they became decadent the moment they reached their zenith.
Yeah.
And I honestly believe it's because they became their most. It was already a dark empire. The I'm going to use a very modern word, but the trauma of a 500-year reconquest was embedded deep in them. Mm-hmm. But I think that Protestantism might have made them a little more optimistic. Mm-hmm. And so I think what happened to the best of Spanish civilization is that their optimism had to be mixed with ridiculousness.
Yeah.
Because it was difficult for them to be earnest. That's the great Protestant virtue, earnestness.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it, I mean, I remember reading Neil Ferguson one time, and he wrote that regarding the 80 Years' War between Holland and Spain, that the 80 Years' War proved that the world's first stock market was more valuable than the world's most productive silver mine. But I was shocked. I was reading something, and I cannot remember what it was. It was fairly recently, but I was reading something where it was closer to the height of the Spanish imperial power or hegemony, where they're bringing in all this gold and silver, and there's this note that in the countryside, which is kind of the heartbeat of any country, the rural agrarian areas, especially in the late medieval world, there's this impoverishment and depopulation going on, where these, the poor underclasses have been completely forgotten by all this wealth. It's completely passed them by, and there's this trenchant fatalism that takes hold, and I think really finds its expression perhaps in the Franco era, in the Civil War. Mm. But yeah, it's just.
Why do you say that?
Yes.
Why do you say that?
I don't know. It just seems an impression to me. It's like an intuitive impression.
Tone-wise, I definitely agree with you. I was just wondering if there was, something concrete you were attaching it to. It's interesting that you raised Franco. My son told me yesterday that today in a Spanish street class, his class would be discussing Franco. Oh, so I'm interested to talk to my son when he comes back. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting thing. I mean, you've got the final collapse of the Spanish Empire really actually only happens at the beginning of the 19th century. You've got the losses to the Americans, right, and then you've got the losses in Morocco. That was actually in 1910 through 12, I think. That was actually a really big disaster for Spain. But you go from the high of having, the silver mine in Potosí, which is putting out 600 tons of silver a year, to Franco, right? I mean, like what a trajectory. It's
so. A side note, my connection to Spanish-speaking Latin America, which is through my American side, has literal connections to the mines in Potosí. So my grandfather was an exploratory geologist who he was born in Long Island, New York, went to the University of Oregon, but spent his life in Peru and Chile.
Wow.
And developing new mines, or just finding new mines. But yeah, doing and I actually went to the area where the Potosí mines are. But that was just sort of a side comment. The main comment I was going to make was, so talking about the final eventual fall of the Spanish Empire, which really it became almost a token empire after the 1830s. But the last great Spanish literary generation. So there are 3 generations in the modern era that have names in Spanish literature. And the last one is the generation of 98. And they were highly traditionalist. They were involved in starting classical education and bringing Latin back. They were not, rabid soil and blood types, but they loved Spain and were highly traditionalist. In fact, I'm including some essays from some of them in my Quixote collection. And they even, when Franco arose, most literary figures sided with Franco against the communists, because the communists were killing all the priests and anybody who liked Latin. And
Yep.
eventually, most of them kind of tried to establish some kind of neutrality because Franco turned out to be a really bad guy too. But just it's interesting that the kind of the last big, because that was not the case in the in the Anglo world. Progressivism was going from strength to strength.
Right.
But there was a moment of arrest before the empire finally collapsed. And you can read these guys talking about the loss of Cuba, the loss of the Philippines, like it really hurts them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they had held these territories as part of their empire for 400 years, right? So
yes, right.
So that's part of it.
And yet the whole time decaying. That's one of the most fascinating things to me about the Spanish Empire.
Yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, you talked about the 1830s, so we're talking about post-Napoleon. We're talking about Bolivar. We're talking about, who's the fellow in Argentina? What was his name?
San Martin.
Yeah, San Martin. Okay, so I read something that you wrote recently about those two fellows, and it really struck a note with me because I'd been listening through Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast a couple years ago, and he speaks about the Bolivarian revolutions and contrasts it with San Martin. But you said something in this little piece you wrote about how the Argentinian character is different from, say, the Brazilian or the Venezuelan or Colombian character. Something about the revolution was different. And would you mind speaking to that? Because I find that very interesting, at least in light of modern events with, what's his name, Milei, or however you say his name in Argentina. And
yeah,
right.
It's very interesting to me. So, yeah. Would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, and I could probably go off in several directions. So you're welcome to guide me as I chatter on. But so when I wrote that essay, the big point I wanted to make was that the vices that Latin American civilization have can mostly be attributed to romanticism, to capital R romanticism, and I drew a connection in that essay between the Romantics and communism.
Right.
And I particularly used one figure who lived long enough to be a romantic figure and to be a part of the formally capital C communist movement. Because what it ends up being is radical individualism. So radical, right? You destroy the family, you destroy the church, you destroy everything. So radical that the only real thing is radical collectivism. Right. You once you break everything, there's only one thing. But so Bolivar was explicitly a romantic man, a romantic thinker. He loved Rousseau. He was actually given volumes of Rousseau by a British general who was, they were supporting the revolution because they were, trying to undermine Spain. And he carried them everywhere with him. So he would ride around with Rousseau in his saddlebags.
Right. That's not a good guy to have in your saddlebag.
So what's that?
I said, that's not a good guy to have in your saddlebag.
Stop it. But yeah, so I there's a reason, like Venezuela, the party in charge, they call themselves Bolivarians, because they see, and not illegitimately, a connection between themselves and their socialism, and of course they don't even try to live up to their ideals. They're just brutal, brutal bullies. But that's the connection, and that is why actually socialism is embedded in the thinking of Latin Americans all over. And it's even more than the other dominant theory about that. The other dominant theory about it has to do with the Incas. The Incas were basically communists. They literally had warehouses, or no one actually owned any land. You had to carry your grain there. But that doesn't account for how it's infiltrated parts of Latin America that had no Inca influence at all.
Yeah.
It's everywhere, including in Brazil and in Argentina and Chile, the Southern Cone. But those places were a little more protected from it because that wasn't really the rhetoric of their revolution. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little less embedded in their thinking, but it's still a constant struggle. Of course, global communism and socialism is a thing, and pushes itself everywhere as much as it can. Its adherents are all globalists. So whether you're an Argentinian commie or a Venezuelan commie or a Bolivian one, you're pushing that on your neighbors as much as you can.
Yeah.
But Argentina and Chile are much more traditionalist. They are also much more European, both like demographically and also in attitude, which gives some credence to the Inca theory. But yeah, they no one likes, other Latin Americans don't like the Argentinians. They say they're racist. There may be some grounds for that, but the Argentinians are constantly referring back to Europe.
Right.
And they think of themselves as European to the point where it's sort of silly. Like some of them will actually say, like, we're the England of South America, or we're the Italy of South America.
Right. Or the Germany, as one may.
As it were, yeah. Yes. Yeah. I don't think any of them actually say that, but yeah, they kind of are. There are lots of Germans there.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. Like Argentina and Chile and Uruguay both had a lot of late waves of immigrants where, there's plenty of, there are plenty of immigration all over the Spanish Empire, starting in the late 1700s. But there were several decades in the 19th century where people were not arriving from elsewhere in the northern part of South America, but they were coming in waves in the Southern Cone. Yeah. In the 20th century, that picked back up. Like there are Syrians and Lebanese all over Latin America.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Germans, the Italians, and that's when people make jokes about all the Germans in southern Brazil or in Argentina, and jokes about Nazi refugees or whatever. The whole reason any Nazis fled down there in the first place was because it was already so full of Germans, right? German, cities, whole German districts, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I make this clear in my mind. When I hear of Simón Bolívar, I think Venezuela, I think Colombia, I think the northern and western parts of South America. Is he the hero in Brazil too? Because Brazil was Portuguese.
No. Right. No, yeah, I mean, people, Brazilians know about San Martin or Bolivar on the same level that we do. Okay. It's someone else's story.
Right.
Brazil had a very different experience. They did not really have a revolution of any kind, romantic or not. And you can even, like, if you look at Latin America, the most prosperous countries are Brazil and the Southern Cone countries. And I think, for a reason, the way they were founded, they have plenty of their own problems, but it's not as problematic. So Brazil came to independence. During the Napoleonic Wars, Spain was conquered, and a puppet king was installed, Napoleon's brother. Portugal was not conquered, but it was this close.
Mm-hmm. This close.
So the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, and they stayed there until after the war. Huh. And the whole government moved with them. And in a very short time, the weight of the empire started to shift. Well, when the royal family moved back, the main figure of the founding of Brazil, Dom Pedro II, he stayed. And after a little while, he sent a letter back home saying, okay, we're our own thing now.
Yeah.
And the Portuguese decided not to fight it.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty wise of them, I think.
So I'm trying I'm trying to understand a little bit like the political dynamics of Brazil. We've got a mutual friend, Jim Witteveen, who works down there. Most of the Brazilians I've talked to are quite libertarian. But from what I've heard, Brazil is a very socialistic country.
Yes. I think socialistic is the perfect word. Very few people actually think they're socialists. But reading studying the history of the education system in Brazil is actually a good way to get a handle on this. The march through the institutions was even more successful there than here. The educational system is completely seized. You already have, the scene is made easier for socialists because Latin Americans generally tend to think much more about centralization. So, when in Anglo civilization, it's very reductive to associate the right wing with fascism, because the conservatives and the so-called right wing, I hate those terms, but I hate the term right wing and left wing because it's from the French Revolution. Yeah. It's also why I hate the metric system. The metric system is objectively better, but
at least with fluid volumes,
it's anti-human and anti-God on purpose. Anyway,
fully agreed.
The Brazilians, like all Latins, tend to be much more comfortable with centralization, and so the tendency is if they are conservatives, they are traditionalists but still statists.
Right.
And because of our education, because of the Brazilian educational system, there are, there are not a lot of those. There's still there's a strong conservative movement. The truckers managed to get Bolsonaro elected a couple of cycles back.
Yeah.
But like Canada, it's not a parliamentary system, but it is a multi-party system that ends up forming coalitions.
Yeah.
Which I think gives more of a chance to go against the zeitgeist, right? Like if you can capture enough on your own and make the right alliances. But overall leftism dominates, leftist thinking dominates. It's actually like it's become routine to see on social media, people are trained. It's a very violent country. There's a lot of crime. People are trained to, after they get shot by a robber and they're in the hospital, they get interviewed. The first thing they say is they start making excuses for the guy who shot them. They're thoroughly indoctrinated. Yeah.
Boy, they sound Canadian.
Yeah. If I get shot by a bad guy.
I thought that, but didn't want to say it. I'm glad you said it.
The more you describe Brazil, the more I'm seeing Alberta.
I'm seeing Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just warmer down there. That's the principal virtue they have, I think, is
and we
warmer.
speak English and not Portuguese.
Yeah, there's a difference. Yeah.
It is pretty funny though, like how thinking of it as Canada, like moving out of the social political sphere. Brazil's a huge country, and so there are Western plains and there are cowboys. It's not just jungle. There's desert, and there are the people who are like cowboys or like desert people or like hill people. So it's like you will see cowboy hats that look like they are
like they're from Arizona
in Calgary.
Yeah.
From the south of Argentina all the way up to Alaska, you see the same cowboy hats.
Nice.
It's not all the Mexican sombreros,
Yeah.
Huh. That's why the best bull riders are Brazilian.
Yeah.
Just want to drop that in there.
Okay. But we still have the best beef up here in Alberta. I think with a with an Angus cow, grass fed, and that marbleization that happens in the cold weather. Like you need that fat to marbleize.
Oh yeah,
it's.
That's how Argentina beats out Brazil. Argentina and Brazil are both big beef producing countries and very good with beef as well.
Yeah.
Argentina can have more northern breeds, like northern European.
Yeah, I suppose they would.
Cattle.
Because Patagonia.
Brazil actually has a lot of the country, they need to use Indian breeds.
Okay.
And there's even mixing. So it's not until you get down south. A lot of the beef still is of like Northern European stock, but there are a lot of different kinds. But I will tell you that the little hump on those little Cebu, like Indian type
Right.
Yep.
cattle, it's pretty tasty.
Okay.
Ah.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
That's good to know.
So I might get myself an Indian cow then and just try it out.
There you go.
Well, that's very interesting. So there's a lot of points of correspondence there. One of the things that I also really enjoyed about I mentioned earlier listening through a podcast, a Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan, and he talks about the Bolivarian and San Martin guys. Their story is very poetic. Like these guys are tragic figures. Like Bolivar gets to the end of his life and he's just in hopeless despair. He can't get anyone to agree to anything. He wants this grand federal Colombia and he can't get guys to agree about like anything. And I found that very interesting because then like you're from Brazil, you're a South American, and you're a poet. And it seems to me that there's something very poetic about the Latin culture. What do you...
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, this is what I want to ask you about, poetry and the Latin culture. What do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently because I recently posted on my Substack just a translation of some song lyrics. But I felt like I had to justify it a bit, by just kind of, I prefaced it with a couple of, just mentioning that, like, if you read Wikipedia articles and biographies of this song lyricist, he has like volumes of poetry published, and he's referred to as a poet, even though, like, and then it's so, my dad used to, used to comment on that as well, how Brazilian music was so much more poetic. I think some of that came from not knowing the best of Anglo music, but it even goes to show like what becomes popular.
Right.
Like that's also a display of the culture.
Yeah.
And, Brazilians famously, like, everyone can play the guitar. And so I do think that there is more of a poetic sensibility. The culture is still as debased as anything Western and modern. Perhaps more so, and certainly in certain areas. Like, I wouldn't want to take you to Carnival.
Right.
But yeah, I think there is, I think that there is, we talked about Protestant optimism. I think one of the things one of the sins that allows Protestants to engage in is pretending everything's okay. And just like putting your head down and working.
Yeah.
But things aren't okay. And so, like, I think there's more of it's a tragic sensibility. I think the French have this a little more visibly too. And that can maybe, be a little more poetic in a way.
Yeah. And the Russians certainly have tragic sensibility on steroids.
Yeah.
I mean, you read their novelists.
Too much for me.
Yeah. So, speaking of poetry, and you are a poet yourself. You write poetry. You enjoy poetry. You think poetry. I would not hesitate to call you the poet laureate of the CREC. Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. I'll tell you a secret.
Yes.
I think of myself as that. So it's good to have that verb.
Good to have confirmation. Yeah.
You should write an epic poem about confirmation bias. So, of all the poems you've written, what's one that you really like? Do you have a favorite that you enjoy?
Goodness.
Those kind of questions are terrible to ask an artist.
Yeah, it really is. It's wide open. I think I know how to answer it.
Yes.
I know the angle of approach here. So I try to I try to be very conscientious to write poetry that is not self-referential, that is not always like poetry for poets. I think that's something that Western art generally has become. Like painters paint for the painting world, and poets write for poets. And it becomes obscurantist in the worst way. Now, I often enjoy that kind of poetry, being a poet myself. And I'm happy to I think when people read my stuff, they see a lot of literary references, etc. But I also try to write in a way that just regular dudes, if they're charitable, will understand, right? I don't want to convince someone who's dedicatedly a Philistine to appreciate my poetry. But if someone wants to, like, if they're willing to, and this is one of the reasons I try to write to be read aloud. Not always with tight, meter and rhyme, but at least in a way where it could be, declaimed and performed. I want it to be a public thing. And so, all that being said, a poem that was included in my last collection from Canon called God Eats is probably the one that people mention to me the most. There are some Thanksgiving poems that I get a lot of messages, people telling me they read them with their family at Thanksgiving, and that makes me really happy. But God Eats it's a poem about martyrdom and being a living sacrifice that really seems to have resonated with people. So my favorite poems are the ones where I know they resonate because people tell me they did.
That's excellent. Do you have one handy to read?
So, you mentioned, before that I might be reading some poetry. I don't have God Eats up, but I could grab it. But I have one on beauty called
please.
Surface Beauty. And then, but I actually had two up, and maybe you'll indulge me and I can read both of them. But there's a poem I wrote 20 years ago, which is it mocks the art world and art philosophy, but through it's like a retelling of Numbers 25 when Phineas runs a spear through the rutting plague bringers. So I could read that one as well.
I'd be happy to hear all of them.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll read the funny one first. It's called The Faithfulness of Images. This is the Phineas one. This is just a reminder to the audience in Numbers 25, a great plague has come upon the people of Israel because the children of Israel are, shall we say, rising up and playing with Moabite women. And one particular, like a prominent young man takes a Moabite woman into his tent, and the plague ends when Phineas goes into the tent and kills them both. There's a reference in this poem to a Rene Magritte painting, which you might have seen. It's of a pipe, and underneath in French it says, "This is not a pipe."
Okay.
I don't know if you guys have ever seen this painting.
No.
Very famous. And of course, it's questioning, it's asking us to question the validity of symbols and images, etc. Pretty tongue-in-cheek, but anyways, here's the poem. It's called The Faithfulness of Images, or Ceci n'est pas un pipe. Numbers 25, retold for the contemporary art world. Most artists suffer from worldly malaise. They feel they've got to get out of this place. If it's the last thing they ever do, if it takes selling old cans of their poo. And just side note, since I'm in the beginning, that is something an artist literally did in the 20th century.
Yes.
I remember this.
Cans and sold them.
Yeah.
Yes. The meaning of things, if read like they're plain, points to a truth, and that'd be insane. So a pipe's not a pipe, it must be a Peter. And if you write poems, there must be no meter. I'll tell you a story, but change it a titch, so it will be modern and relevant and sitch. The Lay of Young Phineas. Now that's a good story, although at the end it gets a bit gory. At Shittim in Moab was a colony of arts. It attracted all of the Moabite tarts. They called out to every Israelite male, "Come on, don't be so uptight and stale. The thing these days is to play the whore and bow down before the Baal of Peor. Our philosophy is one that makes life a feast. We'll party with all, be they man, be they beast. We're most surprised at all of you Jews, for haven't you heard the latest good news? Nothing is real, the walrus hath said. Life is a beach, then you are dead. Our art is subjective, and so is our sex, and we found that it has no ill side effects. So come on, young dude, into my tent, and we'll party as if 'twere the day before Lent. So the sons of the Jews decided to orgy, and sent many thousands to lie in the morgue. De mortuis, I know, it really is shocking. I mean, really, this rhyming is a little too mocking. The elders then spoke, it has to stop now. This evil has killed full 24 thou. They put out an edict, a strong word command, return to the faithful God of your land. Well, some of them did, but some of them Didyonite. And one of the rebels took him a Midianite. He brought her in front of the tent of the meeting. I'm going to get pleasure, for this life is fleeting. That Israelite took her right into his house and was doing with her what you do with a spouse. But Phineas, he thrust a spear through their bellies, right after their bowels with fear turned to jellies. The rebel's last words had been very clear. Dude, he told Phineas, that isn't a spear, meaning subjective. A pipe's not a pipe, and that phallic symbol is really just tripe. Phineas, then, that's an old tune, that song, but soon you will know that my spear's 6 feet long. The flint tip is real, so this is the day I'll circumcise your heart in a literal way. Most artists suffer from what is called ennui. They hurry to bid their cheerless lives bon nuit. Nothing is real, the walrus has said. Life is a beach. Then they are dead. Yes, Christians, when writing, are prone to use simile. Now we see in a mirror, but dimmily. Metaphors are great, and so is a symbol. Without them, we'd sound like resounding cymbals. The waffle is a symbol I know to hate. It oozes its weakness all over my plate. Much more my style is something like wine, which serves me as blood and seems to work fine. The lesson man learns, or else he fries, God never lies.
Huh. I like that. That's great.
That's good.
I like the...
I realized after I started reading it that I might have maybe should have warned you about there being, sexual content.
Well,
sorry.
It is the story. It is Numbers 25. Sometimes when you grew up with the flannel graph in the Sunday school and you read Numbers 25, it does not click. That
Yeah.
They
Right.
didn't. They didn't make images of some of those things.
Yeah, no, they.
JL never made the flannel graph.
No, JL never made the flannel
Have
graph.
you guys seen the Lure TV series that has like these like teddy bears that like do like they do the most gory stories from the Bible?
Right.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard.
Pretty
of it.
awesome.
Yeah, that's excellent.
Pretty cool.
I do like a poetic retelling of that. It really does strike home when Phineas is circumcising, cutting off the heart of flesh. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard a couple of giggles when I read that bit, so I appreciated that.
Well, I do enjoy typology, and typology and poetry I think go together.
Yeah.
And it's
Well,
just,
that poem is over 20 years old now. I wrote that. I actually wrote that when I was old for an NSA student, but I actually wrote that when I was at NSA.
Oh wow!
But yeah, I still enjoy it. There's a lot of old, stuff from 20 years ago in mine that I don't like anymore, really. But that one has held up for me at least.
That one's aged well.
Yeah.
Nice.
Then I have this other poem that is a lot more like meditative and meant to maybe bring a sublime tear to the eye. And I'll just get into it. There's no we're gonna have some whiplash, and this is how it is. And I was pleased, so it's that feedback when people tell me, oh man, that poem meant something for me, really makes a big difference for me. And I wrote this reading a book of essays about beauty, inspired by one of the essays, and I tagged the author on Twitter, on X, and he like immediately asked if I didn't know he was like an editor on an Anglican site that I actually visit occasionally, and he wanted to publish it on there. So it was great to see the person who had inspired the poem, or at least whose writing had inspired the poem, like immediately like just be super pleased with it. So
that's pretty cool.
It's called Surface Beauty, or Analogia Entis, the analogy of being. And it has an epigram in Latin, which I'll read in Latin, but before I do, I'll say what it means, and then I'll read the poem.
All right.
And this poem relies a lot more on on alliteration than it does on any meter or rhyme structure. Yeah, so the epigram says there is one brightness of the sun and another brightness of the moon and another brightness of the stars, and one star differs from another in brightness or glory.
Interesting.
So, some of you guys will, you guys will recognize that, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Here's the poem. It's not a drop dripped deep in each, nor yet a gem set there with care. It's in the air, everywhere, tinted on skins, splashed and slattered. It's visible to every eye. It shines out light, sparkless at dark, goes forth sourceless, but at angels every angle, ubiquitous, too thick to flicker, expressed as yes, as God's own law of entity, the Lord's own word of being to being, shining as shook. There it is.
That's good.
Interesting. So when you're sitting down to write a poem, is this something that you say to yourself, it's Monday morning, 8:00 in the morning, I am going to write a poem, or are these more spontaneous combustions?
They're usually not spontaneous combustions, but they're definitely not, it's Monday morning. It's more like, I haven't done this in a little while. I'm going to sit down and write a poem.
Right. Okay.
But I give myself the ammunition for it by always carrying a notebook around.
Yes.
So I always have a notebook at hand. Mm-hmm. I make notes myself of things I've read or heard or think of, but mostly I write down what other people say and then make quotes out of that stuff.
Well, you know what? I like to tell people that the only brilliant ideas I've ever had were from other people.
Yeah, precisely. And people should embrace that.
Yeah.
Well, I think Peter Lightheart once told us in class at New St. Andrews that basically everything is plagiarized.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, yeah. even if you think about the creative act itself, because we are made by God in His own image, and He is the Uber creator, I guess, if you were to be a German. He does the initial creation. He also does the continual sustaining of all things by the word of His power. But then all of my creativity is a ripoff of divine creativity. Not in a bad way, but that's what it is. It's imitative.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, I think it's Tolkien's term, but regardless of who coined it, we're talking right now about how that doesn't really matter. Sub-creators, right? Yes. We're sub-creators. And we work with the material that He's given us. Of course, is going to be derivative. The being original is, well, first of all, it's a lie. It's a falsehood. We all stand on the shoulders of others. Mm-hmm. But, the word original actually used to mean something else. It used to mean what we mean now when we say aboriginal. Original used to mean it was from the source, from the origin, not that you are the origin of the thing yourself.
But you are hearkening back to the origin.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Exactly.
Interesting.
That makes me think there wasn't even a concept of, sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking God is the originator, really.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
exactly.
And so if you're
the
being
more original you were,
the more you are reflecting Him and His categories.
Yes, at least with the old meaning of the word, right?
Yes.
But that makes me think that there was not even a concept of making something up completely from scratch, of being the sort of towering genius who needed no one. It takes some radical individualism to think that.
To come up with that idea.
Yeah.
So
like modern jazz music, where they abandon all sense of rhythm, all sense of proportion, and it's just noise.
Right. I don't know. Somehow jazz
absolutely.
musicians can actually make it.
Well,
make
jazz
it work
musicians
somehow.
can, but I've heard, I tried one time listening to something that was put out by someone who was more attempting to be more consistent with their espoused presuppositions, and it just sounded like noise.
Yeah.
It was all dissonant chords, and the funny thing
Well,
the funny thing about dissonance is dissonance still relates to, in music, it still relates to the tonic
Yes.
It has to.
It
That's
assumes a standard.
Yeah.
by definition. But anyway, you cannot run from God and his categories.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I I guess this touches both the poems, but what you're describing it has happened across all the arts. Everything has actively been deconstructed.
Yeah.
So one thing my
Alas. Yeah.
yeah. So one thing my wife and I did when we were first dating was we bought a book of T.S. Eliot poems and we read poetry to each other while we were still dating. Something that we should pick up again. But anyway,
Very romantic.
One thing I'm thinking about a little bit is we're bringing different people onto the podcast, and you've got a very unique set of skills with poetry, and we would like to see poetry. Well, more people doing poetry in the Grand Prairie area. So let's say there's somebody listening to our podcast and is like, I want to start writing poetry. Like, what steps would just your average person take to start reflecting more deeply on poetry and possibly even putting out poetry themselves?
Yeah. Well, this actually gives me an opportunity to plug something. This can be kind of tongue in cheek, but also not. So the first thing I would say to such a person would be, when Roman Roads Media puts out my textbook and anthology in March or April, they should buy it.
I love it.
I've written a textbook, which it's called Word Hoard, The Rhetoric of Poetry, and then a big anthology. It doesn't have a title yet, but the idea of it is poems that every Christian should have read or should read. And it's not, and it's huge. Probably going to be about 300 pages. It's that doesn't mean that it's only Christian poets or that it's only poetry about, Christian themes in capital letters, but poems that I think every Christian should read. And then the textbook itself is going to be printed in a workbook style with things to do in the textbook. And it's geared toward upper high school and lower college, which to me means it would be useful to any adult trying to dabble at it. And it goes into everything from the mechanics to the spirit of poetry, not only exposing you to a lot of poetry and breaking it down, but also providing ways to begin to create poetry yourself.
Right.
But the more general answer I would have given before this project would be to start reading poetry and to read stuff you like, stuff that's accessible to you at first. And then you can begin to try to challenge yourself if you wish. But I love Jared Manley Hopkins. I love T.S. Eliot. But, those two are challenging in different ways. But then they also have poems which are super engaging to anyone, which is why I'm a big fan of anthologies. Buying books like, my anthology eventually, but 500 greatest poems or the Oxford collection of English verse and just flipping through, and I like this one. This one is boring. I love poetry and I often have that thought going through anthologies. This one was lame. I didn't like it. So I just start reading it and reading it aloud.
Yes.
The fact that you can read to your wife is fantastic. My kids still have fond memories of when they were little of me being in the bathtub and, they'd bring in a volume of poetry and I would just read them poetry while I soaked. I love a good bath. So reading poetry aloud is really helpful as well. And can actually even help you see, sometimes poetry the reason it wasn't fun when you were reading it in your head is that it sounds dumb out loud, so just make your own judgments. Don't feel like you need to like something because all the powers that be said it's good, especially because the powers that be are suspect, even the Christian ones.
Yes.
The art world, like any other world, they become world pleasers.
Yep.
One poet I would really recommend just to have fun with is Ogden Nash.
Okay.
Who was a journalist, an American journalist, and he wrote poetry that was humorous and ridiculous. and just lines that would run on too long, but like in an obvious way, but like still rhyme. Just silly feeling. He even wrote a few kids books, but he wrote poems about marriage or going out to eat in restaurants or whatever, and they're hilarious. So Ogden Nash is one I'd recommend to someone who they just want to start hearing maybe a musical voice, because even if you have your thought up there in the lonely prairie that you want to be like a very serious Russian poet because it's appropriate to the weather. That's fine. But you can get there through light, fun stuff.
I love it. Speaking of anthologies, that's probably where I started with poetry. For some reason, my mother had bought an anthology book, and it was just something I started with. It's funny, too, you speak about reading out loud, because just the other day, we were having a discussion at the dinner table, my children and my wife and I, and we were talking about Shakespeare. For some reason, he came up. I really love Shakespeare, and my kids have kind of caught this love. One of the things is that loves are caught more than they are taught. And I love Shakespeare because I saw somebody love Shakespeare in front of me. But we were discussing reading Shakespeare aloud, and the children all really enjoy Much Ado About Nothing. And all of a sudden, one of my children, my third oldest, she pipes up and she points at her older sister, and she says, because the two main characters are Benedict and Beatrice, right? And she points at my other daughter and she says, and this is Beatrice. And I was like, this is marvelous, because my older daughter's she's, quick-witted, really loves the repartee and verbal jousting. And the entire family just starts laughing. Like everyone's roaring because we know that's Beatrice. So now we're trying to figure out who her Benedict is, right? And she's only she's 12, so she's blushing like mad, and because we're throwing names at her, and it was marvelous.
She doesn't want to think about how the world must be peopled.
Exactly. She does not want to think about this. So, we're having this remarkably funny moment, all because my 10-year-old made a poetic literary allusion in reference to her sister. And it blessed my heart so much.
It's one of the tragedies of people who don't receive a classical education in some way. You can still live life without that common language, just a common Western inheritance, but it's so much richer when you can, not only talk to each other and talk to other saints, even ones who aren't necessarily English speakers, talk to dead saints. You can have a conversation with C.S. Lewis because you've read the same things he has. It's a beautiful thing. And it's sad that we've lost so much of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. That's one of the reasons why I really like the it's one of the Kepler courses, the Old Western Culture course. My second oldest is working through that right now, and she's really benefiting from it.
We use that with our kids. We're actually still using it with our younger ones. Even before we moved to Moscow. But the guys who publish that are the same people who are going to be publishing my textbook and the anthology. Fun. So they do a great deal. They're big. They have calculus and other things, but their big focus is plain and simply great books.
Yep.
So that's the way to go for sure.
Excellent.
Cool. Excellent. Well, Joffre, it's been a delight to have this conversation with you. I see that our time has just been rolling along here. And it's good to talk about a whole lot of these different things. The Lord moves in the world, and he uses all kinds of different ways to do it. We've talked about South American history. We've talked about Canadian. We've all this stuff. And being able to look at that and to say, well, this is what the Lord's been doing, and he just works on such a broad scale, and to be able to turn that into, as you're doing, you're turning it into poetry that can last. That's very cool. Anyways, I do thank you very much for joining us here today. It's been a delight to talk to you, Joffre.
Yeah, huge pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you invited me, you said it would be very freeform. Promise kept. Very freeform. we did meander all over, like you said. Yeah. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, guys.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Good chatting with you.
Yeah. Blessings to you, our friend.
Bye.
God bless you. So long.
Most excellent.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Swait has left the building. I do like saying that, even though he's not in the building.
Well, I think
it's metaphorical.
I think this conversation has genuinely inspired me to pick up T.S. Eliot again and start reading it to my wife again.
Yeah.
I'm going to go home and read some more Shakespeare.
Yes, I've been short on poetry in my reading in quite a while, so I need.
But
to
not
pick
in
that
your
up.
writing.
Yeah, my writing. Yeah. It's been somewhat poetic, but it's lyrical poetic is what I've done. Lots of that
music,
and I know that it's in lots of people's ears and hearts.
Yeah,
grew up listening to me.
Lyrical poetry is I think an important avenue or stream in the poetic gifting.
Yeah.
You got when you talk about it being in a lot of people's ears, you can make cultural connection with people over popular music.
Yeah,
you quote a lyric and you can immediately tell what generation a man is from.
Yeah.
Right? If you quote Dusty Springfield or something like that, you're like, whoa, okay, this man was listening to music in the 70s.
Yeah.
If he's quoting AC/DC, he's listening to a certain type of music in the late 80s, early 90s, or a Metallica.
Right.
If it's a Lady Gaga, you can't tell because it's just the lyrics. It's not poetic. I mean, yeah. But anyway, you can, or if you quote a country song, right, you're like, okay, this man is coming from this culture. I know I have a touchstone, a point of contact, and that's lyrical poetry gave that.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Well, we are the Chinook Podcast, and it's a delight to have these different conversations. We try and converse with Christian people all over the place if we can. If they're producing things to the glory of God, we can generally have a really good conversation. And so we want to commend this to you, this conversation we've had with Joffre Swait. I hope you folks have really enjoyed this. It is a wintry day here in Grand Prairie, and we are going to go out and enjoy some of it. So blessings to you all.
And one quick note, you can find Joffre Swait's work on YouTube and Substack.
Yes, and X.
And X. So definitely recommend doing that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And go out and write poetry if you can.
And if you can't, learn.
Yeah. All right, have a good day.
Farewell.